The day I learned I was terminally ill was also the day I decided my children needed one final lesson in life. It was a crisp autumn morning when Dr. Winters delivered the news with practiced compassion. 6 months, maybe 8 if we're aggressive, with treatment. His voice had that careful tone doctors perfect over years of delivering death sentences. I nodded, oddly calm as I watched leaves spiral down outside his office window. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you? Do you want me to call anyone for you, Eleanor? He asked, reaching for the phone. No, I said firmly. I'd prefer to handle this my way. Driving home, I felt strangely liberated. At 68, I wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified me was leaving this world without setting things right with my children. Not for my sake, but for theirs. My 3 children, James, Olivia, and Michael, had grown distant over the years. Not all at once, but gradually, like a tide pulling away from shore. There were no dramatic fallouts or ugly confrontations, just the slow erosion of family bonds as they built their separate lives, calling less frequently, visiting only on obligatory holidays. I understood ambition and independence. I'd raised them to be self-sufficient after all. But somewhere along the way, their father and I had failed to teach them about connection, about family as an anchor rather than a burden. Richard, my husband of 40 years, had passed 3 years earlier. His death should have pulled us together, but instead, it seemed to accelerate our drift. The children flew in for the funeral, made appropriate arrangements, then scattered back to their important lives with promises to call that gradually faded into silence. I parked in my driveway and sat staring at the modest 2-story colonial, where I'd raised my family. The house Richard and I had bought when we were young schoolteachers scraping by on meager salaries. None of my children knew that the humble exterior concealed a fortune. Richard and I had lived simply, not out of necessity but by choice. Our teaching salaries were supplemented by Richard's family trust and my surprisingly successful investments in tech startups back when such companies were just ambitious dreams in Silicon Valley garages. We'd amassed just over $12 million, all carefully tucked away in diversified portfolios that none of our children knew existed. We'd made a conscious decision to keep our wealth hidden. We wanted our children to develop their own work ethic, to build lives based on passion rather than expectation of inheritance. It seemed like the right choice at the time. Now, I wondered if we'd made a terrible mistake. Inside the house, I made tea and settled at the kitchen table with my journal, planning what would be my final project. I began to write, "My children need to understand the difference between wealth and worth. They need to learn that a family's value isn't measured in dollars, but in moments of connection. And most importantly, they need to understand that some fortunes can't be measured at all." The next morning, I called my attorney, Diane, who had been handling our affairs for decades. "Eleanor," she greeted warmly. "It's been a while. How are you?" "Terminal, apparently," I replied, cutting to the chase. "Pancreatic cancer. But before you offer condolences, I need your help with something important." There was a moment of silence before Diane responded with the professional composure I appreciated about her. "Of course. What do you need?" "I want to revise my will and create a rather unconventional estate plan." Over the next 2 hours, I outlined my vision. Diane took careful notes, occasionally raising legal concerns or suggesting alternatives when my ideas ventured into potentially problematic territory. "This is quite creative," she said finally. "Are you sure this is how you want to proceed? There are simpler ways to divide your estate." "I'm not interested in simple, Diane. I'm interested in effective. My children have lost their way, and I want to help them find it again before I'm gone." "All right," she sighed. "I'll draw up the paperwork. You'll need to inform your children about the initial meeting. I assume you want that to be a surprise? Complete surprise, I confirmed. If I told them about an inheritance now, they'd suddenly find time to visit their dying mother. I want to see who they really are first. The following Sunday, I texted each of my children individually. I've been feeling unwell lately and would appreciate a visit when you have time. No rush. Love, Mom, it wasn't entirely dishonest. I was unwell, technically speaking. I was curious how they would respond, how they would prioritize this vague request from their mother. James, my oldest at 42, responded first with a brief message. Sorry to hear that. Really swamped with the Beijing deal closing. We'll try for Thanksgiving if it wraps up by then. James had always been my ambitious one. Harvard Business School, followed by a meteoric rise through investment banking. His life was measured in deals closed and bonuses earned. His marriage to Christine had produced 2 children I barely knew, Emma and Jacob, who smiled at me through professionally, photographed Christmas cards but rarely through FaceTime calls. Olivia, my middle child at 39, replied several hours later. Oh no. Have you seen Dr. Winters? I'm in the middle of a huge exhibition but could possibly swing by next month. Let me check my calendar and get back to you. Olivia had inherited her father's artistic talent, but none of his humility. After art school, she'd established herself in the Chicago gallery scene with installations that critics called provocatively minimalist. She was between husbands at the moment, having decided that her second marriage was stifling her creative expression. Michael, my youngest at 36, didn't respond until the following day. Sorry, Mom, just saw this. Not feeling well? Have you tried that holistic doctor I told you about? I'm in Bali until the retreat ends next month, but I can FaceTime when the time difference works out. Michael had started on a conventional path, completing medical school before deciding during residency that Western medicine was too constrained by capitalist interests. He now ran spiritual wellness retreats for wealthy clients seeking enlightenment through guided meditation and organic smoothies. I stared at their responses, feeling a complex mixture of disappointment and resolve. None had asked for specifics about my health. None had offered to rearrange their schedules. None had expressed genuine concern beyond perfunctory questions. This was exactly what I needed to confirm. My children had become exactly what Richard, and I had feared, successful by external metrics, but lacking in the deeper values we had tried to instill. 2 weeks passed, and I began treatment. The side effects were manageable initially, some nausea, fatigue that built throughout the day. I hired a part-time aide named Sophia, who came 3 times a week to help with household tasks and drive me to appointments. Your children don't. Visit? She asked one day as she drove me home from chemo. They're busy with their important lives, I replied, staring out the window. No life is too busy for family, she said firmly, with the confidence of someone young enough to believe in absolutes. I smiled. That's why I like you, Sophia. You still believe in how things should be, not just how they are. During those weeks, I focused on finalizing my plans with Diane, creating a series of letters and organizing decades of family photographs. I also contacted an old colleague, Matthew Jenkins, who had remained close with Richard and me over the years. Are you sure about this approach, Ellie? Matthew asked over coffee in my kitchen. It seems a bit elaborate. Consider it my final teaching moment, I replied. After 40 years in the classroom, I've learned that some lessons need to be experienced, not just heard. And you're certain this is about teaching them, not punishing them? He pushed gently. The question stung because it hit close to home. Was there an element of hurt feelings in my plan? Perhaps. But my intentions went deeper than that. This isn't about revenge, Matt. It's about revelation. They've lost sight of what matters. Success has made them forget their foundations. I want them to remember who they were before titles and achievements defined them. Matthew nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. All right, I'm in. Just tell me what you need me to do. As October turned to November, my condition deteriorated more rapidly than expected. Dr. Winters adjusted my medications, but the pain became a constant companion. I lost weight, my clothes hanging loosely on my frame. Still, no visits from my children, though the texts became more frequent, quick check-ins that required minimal investment. On Thanksgiving morning, to my surprise, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find James standing there, looking uncomfortable. "James," I said, unable to hide my shock. "I wasn't expecting you." "The Beijing deal closed early," he explained, stepping inside without embracing me. "Christine took the kids to her parents, so I thought I'd stop by before heading to the Maldives next week." He paused, finally looking at me properly. "You've lost weight." "Cancer tends to do that," I replied mildly. His face went pale. "Cancer? You didn't say anything about cancer in your text." "You didn't ask," I countered, making my way slowly to the living room. "Tea? Mom, this is serious. What kind? What stage? What's the treatment plan?" The questions came rapidly now, his business mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. "Pancreatic, stage 4. Chemotherapy, though mostly for time rather than cure. 6 months was the initial prognosis, though I suspect it might be less." James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Richard that it made my heart ache. "Why didn't you tell us? Would it have changed your response? Would you have canceled the Beijing deal? Would Olivia have postponed her exhibition? Would Michael have cut short his retreat?" "That's not fair," he protested. But his eyes slid away from mine, answering my question more honestly than his words. "I'm not interested in fairness at this point, James. I'm interested in reality. You've all built successful lives, just as your father and I hoped. But somewhere along the way, you forgot what success really means." He sat down heavily on the sofa. "I should call Olivia and Michael." "If you feel that's necessary," I said, carefully lowering myself into my favorite armchair. "But before you do, there's something you should know. I've arranged a family meeting with my attorney on December 15th. I'd like all 3 of you to be there." His eyebrows rose. "Attorney? Is this about arrangements?" "In a manner of speaking," I replied. "It's about the estate." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Estate? Mom, this house is nice, but it can't be worth that much. And Dad's life insurance covered the funeral costs. We don't need to—" "December 15th, James. I'd appreciate if you could make yourself available. And please inform your brother and sister. You 3 seem to communicate more with each other than with me these days." He looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded instead. "All right, December 15th. After he left, I felt exhausted but satisfied. The first piece was in place. Now I just needed to stay alive long enough to see my plan through. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity. Suddenly, my children were calling daily. Olivia flew in the following weekend, horrified by my appearance and full of research about experimental treatments. Michael cut his retreat short, arriving with suitcases full of herbal supplements and meditation guides. Their concern seemed genuine, but I couldn't help noticing how quickly the conversation turned to logistics, and eventually to finances. "Mom, these treatments can be expensive," Olivia said delicately one evening. "Do you have enough saved? Your teacher's pension can't cover everything." "I've managed my finances carefully," I responded vaguely. "Don't worry about money. But we should know what we're dealing with," James insisted. "For planning purposes. All will be revealed on the 15th, I said with a small smile. "Patience was never your strong suit, James." They exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by my evasiveness. As the meeting approached, my children became increasingly attentive. James delayed his trip to the Maldives indefinitely. Olivia had her assistant reschedule exhibitions. Michael set up a small meditation space in the spare bedroom, offering daily sessions to align my healing energies. I accepted their attention without comment, neither encouraging nor discouraging their sudden devotion. I observed their interactions, noting how they whispered when they thought I was resting, how they scoured the house when they thought I was asleep, looking for bank statements, investment records, anything to give them insight into what might be revealed at the meeting. The day before our appointment with Diane, I overheard them in the kitchen. "It has to be significant," James was saying. "Otherwise, why the formal meeting with an attorney?" "Maybe she's been secretly saving her whole life," Olivia suggested. "You know how frugal they always were." "On teachers' salaries?" Michael scoffed. "Even with extreme saving, we're talking about a modest amount at best. Whatever it is, we need to make sure it's managed properly," James replied. "Mom's not exactly financially sophisticated. Dad always handled the money." I backed away silently, their assumptions confirming what I already knew. They saw me as their unassuming, financially naive mother, a retired school teacher who couldn't possibly understand complex financial matters. They had no idea that I had managed our investment portfolio for decades, consistently outperforming the market through careful research and calculated risk-taking. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow would change everything. Not because of the money they would learn about, but because of the conditions attached to it. My final lesson was prepared, and soon my children would face a choice that would reveal who they truly were. I fell asleep thinking of Richard, wondering if he would approve of my plan. I like to think he would understand that sometimes the most important lessons require the most difficult tests. After all, that's what we both believed as teachers, that true education transforms not just the mind, but the heart. The stage was set. Tomorrow, my children would learn the truth about our family's wealth, and more importantly, about themselves. On the morning of December 15th, I woke before dawn. The pain was worse today, radiating from my abdomen in persistent waves that made each breath a conscious effort. I took my medication and sat by the window, watching darkness give way to the pale winter light. Today would change everything. By 7, I could hear my children stirring through the house. The nervous energy was palpable, cabinet doors opening and closing, hushed conversations, the coffee maker running twice. They were preparing for what they clearly believed would be a significant revelation. I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress and pearl earrings that Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary. I applied a touch of makeup to soften the hollowness of my cheeks. This was a performance in many ways, and I wanted to look the part of the composed matriarch. "You look nice," Olivia commented when I came downstairs, surprise evident in her voice. "Should I change?" I didn't realize. This was a formal thing. "Wear whatever makes you comfortable," I replied. "Diane isn't concerned with our fashion choices." James was already dressed in a suit, scrolling through emails on his phone, while Michael sat cross-legged on the sofa in what he called his mindfully casual attire. Expensive linen pants and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than a month of my teacher's salary. "I made you some ginger tea," Michael offered, extending a steaming mug. "It's excellent for inflammation and digestion." "Thank you," I said, accepting it, though I doubted its efficacy against stage 4 cancer. Still, the gesture itself was worth acknowledging. The drive to Diane's office was quiet, tension filling the car as James navigated morning traffic. I noticed how they'd naturally arranged themselves, James driving, Olivia in the passenger seat. Managing the GPS, Michael in the back with me, occasionally checking my comfort. They'd fallen into their childhood roles without realizing it: the leader, the organizer, the caretaker. Diane's office occupied the top floor of a modest professional building downtown. Her receptionist, the same young man who had been there for at least a decade, greeted us warmly. Mrs. Harrison, Ms. Winters is expecting you and your family. Please go right in. Diane stood as we entered, coming around her desk to embrace me gently. Eleanor, you're looking well. A polite lie, but I appreciated it. This is James, Olivia, and Michael, I introduced, though Diane knew exactly who they were from photographs I'd shared over the years and the lengthy discussions we'd had about my plan. A pleasure to meet you all, she said, gesturing to the conference table where Matthew Jenkins was already seated. And I believe you know Mr. Jenkins? Uncle Matt? James said with surprise. What are you doing here? Matthew had been Uncle Matt to my children since they were small, though no blood relation existed. He and Richard had taught together for decades, their friendship extending to family dinners and summer vacations. Supporting your mother, he replied simply, standing to shake hands with each of them. Once we were all seated, Diane opened a leather portfolio. Thank you all for coming today. As you know, your mother has asked me to discuss certain matters related to her estate planning. Before we begin, I want to confirm that this meeting is being recorded for legal purposes. Does anyone object? My children exchanged glances but shook their heads. Excellent, Diane continued. Eleanor, would you like to start, or shall I? I'll begin, I said, folding my hands on the table. As you know, I've been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. My prognosis is 6 months, though recent developments suggest it may be less. I've arranged this meeting to discuss the disposition of my estate. James leaned forward slightly. We're here to support whatever decisions you've made, Mom. That's very generous of you, I replied with a slight smile, considering you don't yet know what those decisions are. I took a breath and continued. Your father and I lived modestly throughout our lives, as you well know. What you don't know is that this was by choice, not necessity. Diane slid a document toward the center of the table. It was a comprehensive financial statement showing the current value of my estate, $12.4 million. The silence that followed was profound. Olivia picked up the paper first, her eyebrows rising as she scanned the figures. This can't be right, she finally managed. I assure you it's accurate to within a few $1,000s, Diane confirmed. The Harrison estate consists of several investment portfolios, 2 commercial properties in downtown Westfield, a vacation home in Maine that's been in a rental program for the past decade, and various other assets. James took the paper from his sister, his expression transforming from shock to calculation before my eyes. But how? Dad was a high school English teacher. You taught elementary school. We're also thoughtful investors, I explained. Your grandfather left your father a modest trust, which provided us with capital to begin investing in the late 1970s. I developed an interest in emerging technologies and made several early investments in companies that proved quite successful. We lived on our teaching salaries and reinvested all returns. You never told us, Michael said quietly. No, we didn't, I agreed. Your father and I believed that knowing about family wealth would influence your life choices, perhaps not for the better. We wanted you to develop your own work ethic, to pursue careers based on passion rather than expectation. So you lied to us, Olivia stated flatly. We omitted information we felt wasn't necessary for you to know at the time, I corrected. You never asked about our finances, and we never volunteered the information. But all those years of coupon cutting, bargain hunting, James began, were genuine practices we believed in, I finished for him. Wealth doesn't justify waste, James. That was another lesson we hoped to teach by example. Michael was still staring at the financial statement. What about college? I took out student loans, we all did. Which you repaid, demonstrating responsibility and commitment, I pointed out. Would you have valued your education as much if it had been handed to you without cost? That wasn't your decision to make, Olivia argued, color rising in her cheeks. We're your children, not your social experiment. I felt a flash of hurt at her words, but kept my expression neutral. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps we should have told you sooner. But we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do now. And what exactly is that? James asked, his business instincts clearly engaging. How do you intend to distribute the estate? Diane cleared her throat. That's where this meeting becomes somewhat unconventional. Eleanor has established a rather unique estate plan. Mr. Jenkins will be serving as the trustee. Matthew nodded, solemnly. A responsibility I take very seriously. The estate will not be distributed immediately upon Eleanor's passing, Diane continued, nor will it be divided equally amongst the three of you without conditions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. What conditions? James asked, his voice carefully controlled. I took over. Each of you will have the opportunity to receive 1/3 of the estate, approximately $4 million. However, to qualify for your portion, you must complete a series of tasks that I've outlined. These tasks must be completed within 1 year of my passing. Tasks? Olivia repeated incredulously. What kind of tasks? Personal challenges designed specifically for each of you, I explained. Matthew will provide you with the details at the appropriate time. And if we refuse? Michael asked. Then your portion will be donated to charity, I said simply. Specifically to educational initiatives for underprivileged children. This is ridiculous, Olivia burst out. We're not children. You can't make us jump through hoops for our inheritance. Actually, she can, Diane interjected calmly. The law allows considerable latitude in how a person chooses to distribute their assets. The conditions Eleanor has established are unusual but legally sound. I assume there's paperwork for us to sign, James said, his business mask firmly in place now. Not today, Diane replied. Today is simply to inform you of the general structure. The specific conditions will remain confidential until after Eleanor's passing? So we don't even get to know what these tasks are? Olivia demanded, making air quotes around the word. That's correct, I confirmed. Though I can tell you they are not impossible, illegal, or harmful. They are simply challenges I believe each of you needs to face. This feels manipulative, Michael said quietly, disappointment evident in his voice. Using money to control us from beyond the grave. His words stung more than I expected. I understand why you might see it that way, I acknowledged. But my intention isn't control, it's revelation. These tasks aren't about me. They're about helping each of you reconnect with something essential you've lost. And you're the judge of what we've lost? Olivia challenged. I'm your mother, I replied simply. I've watched each of you grow from curious, compassionate children into successful but increasingly isolated adults. Yes, I believe I do have some insight into what you've lost along the way. The room fell. Silent again. James was the first to recover, his pragmatic nature asserting itself. Is there anything else we need to know today? He asked Diane. Just one more item, she responded, sliding 3 identical envelopes across the table. Eleanor has prepared letters for each of you. She asks that you read them privately, after you've had time to process today's information. My children took their envelopes with varying expressions, James with resignation, Olivia with lingering anger, Michael with a mixture of hurt and curiosity. If there are no further questions, I believe we're finished for today, Diane concluded. The drive home was silent, tension thick enough to touch. When we arrived, James immediately headed to the guest room where he was staying, closing the door firmly behind him. Olivia poured herself a generous glass of wine despite the early hour. Michael disappeared outside, presumably to meditate. Made my way slowly to the sunroom, easing into the cushioned chair by the window. It had gone exactly as I'd expected. Shock, followed by indignation, followed by retreat. They needed time to process, to recalibrate their understanding of their parents and their potential inheritance. Sophia arrived shortly after, helping me with my afternoon medications. "How did it go?" she asked, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "About as well as dropping a bombshell can go," I replied. "They're processing." "Processing the money or processing the conditions?" she asked shrewdly. "Both, I imagine. 12 million is significant, but it's the conditions that truly surprise them. They're not accustomed to having strings attached to anything in their lives anymore." The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo. My children moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding each other as much as they avoided me. I didn't push for conversation, giving them the space they needed. It was after dinner, a mostly silent affair with minimal conversation, when James finally approached me in the living room. "I want to understand," he said, sitting across from me. "Why the secrecy all these years, and why the conditions now?" I studied my oldest child, noting the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there just a few years ago. The burden of his success was taking its toll. The secrecy was a decision your father and I made together, I explained. We believed, perhaps misguidedly, that it was better for you to make your way without the cushion or expectation of inheritance. As for the conditions, they're not punishments, James. They're opportunities. Opportunities for what? For recalibration. For remembering. For reconnecting with parts of yourself you've set aside in pursuit of external success. He frowned. That sounds very philosophical, but it's not particularly clear. It's not meant to be clear yet, I replied. Understanding will come with the experience itself. You're really not going to tell us what these tasks are? No. He sighed, running a hand through his hair in that gesture so reminiscent of his father. You realize this puts us in an impossible position. We're mourning you, or preparing to, while simultaneously wondering what hoops we'll need to jump through after you're gone. Life rarely separates its challenges into neat, manageable packages, I observed. Sometimes the most important growth happens when multiple demands converge. James stood, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. I should get back to my calls. Beijing is waking up now. Of course, I said mildly. Business doesn't stop, does it? He paused at the doorway, turning back with a searching look. Is that what this is about? You think we work too much? This is about much more than work hours, James. But I suspect you'll understand that better when the time comes. After he left, Olivia appeared, wineglass in hand. Unlike James, she didn't pretend to seek understanding. For the record, she said, leaning against the doorframe, I think this is incredibly unfair. We've built our lives based on the information we had. If we'd known about this money sooner, we might have made different choices. What choices would you have made differently? I asked, genuinely curious. She considered this, swirling her wine. I might have opened my own gallery instead of fighting for space in other people's. I might have taken more risks with my work. The money would have made you braver? Her eyes narrowed. Don't psychoanalyze me, Mom. That's not what I meant. What did you mean then? I meant that options change when resources change. That's just reality. And yet, you've achieved considerable success without those additional resources, I pointed out. Your last exhibition sold out, didn't it? That's not the point, she insisted. What is the point, Olivia? She finished her wine in one long swallow. The point is that parents shouldn't manipulate their adult children, not while they're alive, and certainly not from beyond the grave. With that, she turned and left, her footsteps receding down the hallway. Michael was the last to seek me out, finding me in my bedroom where I'd retreated to rest. The day had exhausted me more than I wanted to admit. Can I come in? He asked softly, knocking on the open door. Of course. I patted the edge of the bed, and he sat carefully, as though afraid I might break. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, about each of us losing something essential. Leave it to Michael, my most introspective child, to focus on the philosophical heart of the matter rather than the practical implications. "And what conclusions have you reached?" I asked. I think maybe we've all become versions of ourselves that function well in the world, but aren't necessarily authentic to who we really are." He looked at me uncertainly. "Is that what you meant?" I smiled, reaching for his hand. "That's part of it, yes. So these tasks, they're designed to help us reconnect with our authentic selves?" "Among other things," I replied. "But each of you needs something slightly different from the experience." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand, at least conceptually. I'm still not happy about the method, though." "You don't have to be happy about it," I told him. "You just have to decide whether the journey is worth taking, whatever your motivation might be." "Even if that motivation is just the money?" he asked with a hint of his old wry humor. "Even then," I confirmed. "Sometimes we begin journeys for the wrong reasons, but end up exactly where we need to be." He squeezed my hand gently before standing. "Get some rest, Mom. It's been a long day." After he left, I lay back against my pillows, exhaustion washing over me in waves. The first phase of my plan was complete. The revelation had been made, the conditions established. Now came the difficult part, letting go. I wouldn't live to see how my children responded to their individual challenges. I wouldn't witness their struggles or their breakthroughs. I had to trust that the seeds I was planting would eventually take root, even in the rocky soil of their resistance. As sleep began to claim me, I thought again of Richard. "I'm doing my best," I whispered to his memory. "I hope it's enough." In the darkness of my room, with the weight of the day settling around me like a heavy blanket, I allowed myself to acknowledge the fear I'd been holding at bay. Not fear of dying, but fear of failing in this final, most important teaching moment of my life. The days following our meeting with Diane brought a subtle but distinct shift in my household. My children remained in my home, ostensibly to care for me, though I suspected their newfound attentiveness had multiple motivations. They established an unspoken rotation system, ensuring that at least one of them was always with me, while the others managed their professional obligations remotely. I found James working in the den one afternoon, his laptop open to spreadsheets as he spoke in hushed tones on a conference call. He held up a finger when I entered, signaling me to wait while he finished his conversation. I stood patiently, observing how he commanded the virtual room even from my modest home office. "Beijing is hesitant about the exclusivity clause," he said, his voice carrying that polished authority he'd cultivated over years of high-stakes negotiations. "But I've reminded them that without it, Frankfurt will likely intervene within 6 months." I settled into the armchair by the bookshelf, feeling another wave of pain wash through me. The medications were becoming less effective as the disease progressed. James glanced at me, a flicker of concern crossing his face, but he continued, his call without interruption. When he finally hung up, he closed his laptop and turned to me. "Sorry about that. Critical deal on the line. Did you need something, Mom?" "Just company," I replied, though I didn't mean to interrupt. "It's fine," he said, though his eyes drifted back to his closed laptop. "How are you feeling?" "About as well as can be expected." An awkward silence settled between us. Conversation had never been difficult with James when he was younger. As a boy, he'd been full of questions about everything: how clouds formed, why the stock market fluctuated, what made Shakespeare's sonnets endure. Now, it seemed we had nothing to say to each other. "I read your letter," he finally said, "the one Diane gave us. I'd written each letter carefully, tailoring my words to each child's specific journey. James's letter had focused on his relentless ambition, the price he'd paid for success, and the growing distance between him and his own children." "And what did you think?" I asked. He tapped his fingers on the desk, a nervous habit from childhood. You made some presumptions about my life and my choices. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps I simply observed patterns you haven't had the distance to see. My career requires sacrifice, he said defensively. Not everyone understands that. I understand sacrifice quite well, James. The question is whether what you're sacrificing is worth what you're gaining. He looked away, unwilling to engage with the heart of the matter. These tasks you've planned for us, are they designed to make us feel guilty? Because I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. I won't apologize for my success. I've never asked you to apologize for success, I pointed out, only to question your definition of it. And if my definition differs from yours, then you'll make your choices accordingly. That's always been your right. He shook his head slightly, frustration evident in the tightness around his mouth. This whole scenario feels like manipulation. I understand why you might see it that way, I said softly. But consider this, James. If the money were simply given to you with no conditions, would you change anything about how you live? Would you reconsider any of the choices you've made? His silence was answer enough. Sometimes, I continued, we need a catalyst for reflection. Consider the tasks a catalyst, nothing more. Before he could respond, his phone chimed with another message. He glanced at it instinctively. I should take this. Of course, I said, rising slowly from my chair. Business doesn't wait. He had the grace to look slightly ashamed as I left the room. Later that evening, I found Olivia in the kitchen, uncharacteristically preparing dinner. She'd never shown much interest in cooking before, claiming it was conventional domesticity that didn't align with her artistic temperament. You're cooking, I observed, easing myself onto a stool at the counter. Don't sound so surprised, she replied, chopping vegetables with more enthusiasm than skill. I'm not completely helpless. I never thought you were. She glanced up at me, her expression softening slightly. Michael's gone to pick up your prescriptions, and James is still on calls. I thought you should eat something besides takeout. That's thoughtful, thank you. She returned to her chopping, the rhythm of the knife punctuating the silence between us. Olivia had always been my most volatile child, passionate, expressive, quick to anger, but equally quick to forgive. Her emotions lived close to the surface, unlike James, who buried his feelings beneath layers of professional polish. Your letter, she said suddenly, her knife pausing mid-chop. You talked about my marriages, about how I collect relationships like exhibition pieces, displaying them briefly before moving on to the next installation. That was cruel, Mom. I held her gaze steadily. Was it untrue? It was reductive, she countered. My relationships are complex. You make it sound like I'm some shallow socialite collecting men like handbags. That wasn't my intention, I said carefully. But I've watched you leave 2 marriages when they became challenging. I've seen how you pursue intensity rather than depth. What's wrong with intensity? She demanded, knife forgotten. Not everyone wants the kind of marriage you and Dad had. Practical, stable, predictable. I couldn't help but smile at her characterization. Is that what you think our marriage was? Wasn't it? You lived in the same house for 40 years. You taught at the same schools until retirement. You had your routines, your quiet evenings, your sensible investments. She shrugged. It worked for you, but it would suffocate me. Our marriage had passion you never saw, I told her. Your father and I simply understood the difference between passion that consumes and passion that sustains. She rolled her eyes slightly. Please spare me the marriage advice, Mom, especially when it comes packaged with conditional inheritance. The inheritance isn't about your marital status, Olivia. It's about something much more fundamental. My inability to commit? She guessed sarcastically. Your fear of vulnerability, I corrected gently. In your art, you're fearless. willing to expose your deepest thoughts and emotions. But in your personal relationships, you run at the first sign that someone might truly see you, flaws and all. Her cheeks flushed with anger. That's not fair. Maybe not, I conceded. But consider this. When was the last time you allowed yourself to be truly known by another person? Not the curated version of yourself that you present to the world, but the messy, complicated, wonderful person beneath the performance? She turned away, busying herself with the cutting board. I should finish dinner before Michael gets back. I recognized the deflection but didn't push further. Seeds need time to germinate, even when planted in resistant soil. Michael returned with my medications and joined us for dinner. The conversation remained carefully neutral. Updates on mutual acquaintances, discussions about a documentary Michael had recently watched, Olivia's upcoming exhibition in Toronto. Nobody mentioned the inheritance or the conditions attached to it, though the subject hovered in the air like a fog, obscuring genuine connection. After dinner, I retreated to my room earlier than usual, fatigue weighing heavily on me. I sent a brief text to Matthew. Progress is slow, but seeds are planted. How are preparations coming? His response came quickly. Everything is in place. Letters written, accounts prepared, tasks organized. Rest easy, Ellie. I found his assurance comforting. Matthew understood what I was trying to accomplish better than anyone. He'd witnessed the gradual distancing of my children over the years, had seen how success had changed them in ways both subtle and profound. He'd also known Richard and me intimately enough to understand our values, our hopes for our children beyond material achievement. The next morning, I woke to muffled voices outside my bedroom door. I recognized the tension in the hushed tones, though I couldn't make out the words. Curiosity overcame my discomfort as I carefully made my way to the door, opening it just enough to hear more clearly. Absolutely ridiculous, James was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. We're successful adults being treated like children who need to be taught a lesson. Maybe we do need a lesson, Michael responded, his tone more measured. When was the last time any of us visited Mom before she got sick? When did we last call just to check in? Not because we needed something. Don't try to claim moral high ground here, Olivia snapped. You were in Bali running your little rich people retreats. It's not like you were dropping by for Sunday dinners. I'm not claiming high ground, Michael defended. I'm just saying maybe Mom has a point about us losing our way. We've all become so wrapped up in our own lives. Spare me the spiritual, awakening narrative, James interrupted. This is about control, plain and simple. Mom and Dad controlled the narrative our entire lives, hiding their wealth while watching us struggle through college loans and starter apartments. Now she's trying to control us from beyond the grave. So what's your solution? Michael asked. Refuse the inheritance on principle? There was a pause before James replied, his voice lower. No, I'm saying we need to be strategic about this. We play along, complete whatever arbitrary tasks she's set up, and then we're free to use our inheritance. However we choose. That feels wrong, Michael said slowly. Using Mom's death as a transaction. It's not a transaction, James insisted. It's recognizing the reality of the situation. Mom has set conditions. We can meet them and receive what's rightfully ours. Or we can refuse on principle and get nothing. I'm simply being practical. For once, I agree with James, Olivia added. We don't have to like the method to accept the outcome. $4 million could change each of our lives. I could open my own gallery, stop answering to curators with half my talent and twice my connections. And what about what Mom actually wants us to learn from this? Michael pressed. We're adults, James replied firmly. We decide what lessons we need to learn. I closed the door quietly, returning to my bed with a heaviness that had nothing to do with my physical condition. I hadn't expected immediate transformation. I knew my children too well for that. But hearing their conversation brought home the magnitude of the challenge I'd undertaken. James's pragmatic approach didn't surprise me. He'd always been one to find the most efficient path to any goal. Olivia's alignment with him was more unexpected. She usually opposed James on principle, but the lure of financial independence clearly appealed to her artistic ambitions. And Michael, despite his spiritual posturing, was clearly torn between principled resistance and practical acceptance. Later that day, Dr. Winters visited for a home evaluation. His examination confirmed what I already felt. The disease was progressing more rapidly than expected. My pain management regimen needed adjustment, and we discussed hospice options for the coming weeks. My children listened to his explanations with varying expressions of distress. Despite their complicated feelings about my estate plan, the reality of my impending death was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about saying goodbye. After Dr. Winters left, we gathered in the living room, an impromptu family meeting that nobody had called but everyone understood was necessary. Hospice, James said, the word hanging heavily in the air. You're sure that's what you want, Mom? We could look into experimental treatments. I have connections. At Memorial Sloan Kettering. I've made my peace with this journey. I interrupted gently. Quality of life matters more to me now than quantity. But, he began. James, I said firmly, I've had 68 wonderful years. I've loved and been loved. I've taught generations of children. I've traveled and read great books and watched sunsets that took my breath away. It's enough. He looked away, blinking rapidly, and I realized with a pang that my practical, business-minded son was fighting tears. What can we do? Michael asked softly. To make things easier for you? I considered his question, looking at each of my children in turn. You can talk to me. Really talk to me. Not about business or art exhibitions or wellness retreats. Tell me what you dream about. Tell me what you fear. Tell me who you are now, not just what you do. Olivia shifted uncomfortably. That's pretty intense, Mom. Dying has a way of cutting through small talk, I replied with a small smile. Suddenly, only the essential matters. A silence fell over the room, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. My request had disarmed them, stripping away the professional personas they'd cultivated so carefully. I'm afraid of failing, James said suddenly, surprising all of us. Not just at work, but at everything that matters. My marriage is struggling. Christine says I'm never present, even when I'm physically there. My kids barely know me. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture so like his father's. I keep telling myself it's temporary, that once this deal closes or that project launches, I'll have more time. But there's always another deal. Another project. I understand that pattern, I said quietly. Your father struggled with it too, early in his career. James looked up, genuine surprise on his face. Dad? But he was always present. Always involved. Not always, I corrected. There was a period when you were very young, before Olivia was born, when Richard was pursuing his doctoral degree, while teaching full-time. He became so absorbed in his academic ambitions that he nearly missed your childhood entirely. I smiled at the memory. It took a minor crisis to snap him out of it. What crisis? Olivia asked, curiosity piqued. You, I told her. Or rather, the news that you were coming. Richard realized he needed to make a choice about what truly mattered to him. He chose family. He chose presence. He abandoned his doctoral program and refocused his energy on being the kind of father and husband he wanted to be. I never knew that, James said softly. There's a lot you don't know about your parents, I replied. We didn't share every struggle or decision with you children. Perhaps that was a mistake. I'm afraid too, Olivia admitted, drawing our attention. Not of failing exactly, but of settling. Of waking up one day and realizing my life has become small and predictable. She twisted a silver ring on her finger. Sometimes I think that's why my marriages didn't last. I panicked at the first. Sign of routine, convinced that contentment was just another word for surrender. And what about joy? I asked her. Where does joy fit into your equation? She looked startled by the question. Joy? Yes, joy. Not the fleeting excitement of a new relationship or a successful exhibition, but the deep, abiding joy that comes from meaningful connection. Have you experienced that? I'm not sure, she admitted. Michael, who had been listening intently, spoke up. I'm afraid of inauthenticity, of realizing that all my spiritual seeking has just been another form of escape. He gave a self-deprecating smile. Sometimes I wonder if my wellness retreats actually help anyone, or if they're just elaborate. Performances designed to make wealthy people feel enlightened without requiring real change. I reached out to take his hand, then Olivia's, then James. Thank you for your honesty, for allowing yourselves to be vulnerable, if only for a moment. They seemed surprised by their own openness, as though the words had escaped before they could filter them through their usual protective layers. This, I said, squeezing their hands gently. This connection, this truth, this is the inheritance that matters most. Not the money, not the property, this capacity for authentic presence with each other. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of vulnerability gradually giving way to a tentative peace. It wasn't a complete transformation. Decades of patterns wouldn't dissolve in a single conversation, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the carefully constructed walls they'd built around their hearts. Later, after they'd gone to their separate rooms, I sent another text to Matthew. A breakthrough today, small but real. Perhaps there's hope after all. As I drifted toward sleep, I felt a curious mixture of sadness and satisfaction. I would not live to see the full fruition of what I'd set in motion. I would not witness my children complete the tasks I'd designed for them, or experience the changes those challenges might catalyze. But I had seen a glimpse of possibility today, a moment of genuine connection that reminded me of who they once were, and who they might become again. It wasn't enough, but it was something. A foundation upon which Matthew could build after I was gone. A small victory in what sometimes felt like an impossible battle against time and ingrained patterns. Tomorrow would bring more pain, more difficult conversations, more resistance. But tonight, I would rest in the knowledge that beneath the armor of success and sophistication, my children's hearts remained accessible. Different, certainly. Scarred, perhaps, but not beyond reach. Christmas arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed the neighborhood into a scene from a holiday card. From my bedroom window, I watched children across the street building a snowman, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. It struck me that this would be my last Christmas. Thought that should have brought more sadness than it did. Instead, I felt a curious sense of completion, as though my life were a book reaching its final necessary chapter. My own children had decorated the house with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. Olivia unearthed boxes of ornaments from the attic, exclaiming, over hand-painted ceramics and popsicle stick creations from their elementary school days. James assembled the artificial tree with the same focused precision he applied to business deals, while Michael hung lights with a reverence that suggested he viewed the task as something approaching a spiritual practice. I observed their efforts. From my wheelchair, another new addition to our household. My body was failing rapidly now, strength ebbing away like water through cupped hands. The hospice nurse visited daily, adjusting medications and offering quiet support. My children watched these visits with barely concealed distress, though they maintained brave faces in my presence. Remember this, Angel? Olivia asked, holding up a tarnished silver ornament. Dad bought it the year I was born. Your father bought. An angel for each of you, I confirmed. It was his tradition. He believed angels watched over new lives. I didn't know that, Michael said softly, taking the ornament from his sister to study it more closely. I always thought they were just decorations. There are many things you didn't know about your father, I replied. He was a deeply sentimental man beneath his practical exterior. Like his secret fortune? James asked, though without the edge his voice might have carried weeks earlier. I smiled. The money was practical, not sentimental. Though I suppose keeping it secret was an emotional decision as much as a rational one. I've been thinking about that, James said, carefully hanging a glass snowflake on a branch. About why you and Dad kept the money hidden for so long. And what conclusions have you reached? I asked. He considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. I think maybe you were trying to protect us from something, not just from entitlement or laziness, but from losing our way. He glanced at me. Am I close? Very, I acknowledged. We watched families around us with significant wealth who made inheritance the cornerstone of their children's identities. Those children often struggled to develop their own sense of purpose or direction. They defined themselves by their family name and bank account, rather than by their character or contributions. So you wanted us to build our own identities, Olivia surmised, without the shadow of family wealth hanging over us. Precisely. We wanted you to know the satisfaction of earning your own success, of overcoming obstacles through perseverance rather than privilege. But now you're giving us the money anyway, Michael pointed out, with conditions attached. I'm offering you the opportunity to claim it, I corrected. There's a difference. And by now you've all established your professional identities. The inheritance can't define you unless you allow it to. As for the conditions, I continued, consider them a counterbalance, a way to ensure that wealth serves your growth rather than stunting it. My children exchanged glances, a silent communication, passing between them. I sensed they'd been discussing the inheritance among themselves, perhaps reaching new understandings in private conversations I wasn't privy to. The doorbell rang, interrupting our discussion. James went to answer it, returning moments later, with Matthew Jenkins, arms laden with brightly wrapped packages. "Merry Christmas, Harrison family," he called cheerfully, stomping snow from his boots in the entryway. "Uncle Matt," Olivia greeted him, accepting his embrace. "We didn't expect you until dinner." And miss the tree decoration? Not a chance. He approached my wheelchair, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "How are you feeling today, Ellie?" "Present," I replied simply. "Grateful for this day." He nodded, understanding the layers beneath my answer. Matthew had become a frequent visitor over the past weeks, bringing books, sharing meals, reminiscing about decades of friendship with Richard and me. My children had initially viewed his presence with suspicion, seeing him primarily as the trustee of my estate rather than as the family friend he had always been. Gradually, those suspicions had given way to a cautious appreciation for his steady support. We spent the afternoon completing the decorations and preparing a simplified version of our traditional Christmas dinner. The hospice nurse had advised against rich foods, so we adapted. Roast chicken instead of ham, mashed sweet potatoes without the usual brown sugar glaze, steamed vegetables rather than heavy casseroles. Despite the modifications, it was the most pleasant meal we'd shared in years. The conversation flowed naturally, unmarred by the awkward pauses or surface-level exchanges that had characterized our previous family gatherings. James spoke of his children, my grandchildren, with genuine warmth, showing us videos of their recent school performances. Olivia described her new artistic direction, a series exploring memory and family connection that represented a significant departure from her previous work. Michael talked about a community garden project he'd become involved with, helping underprivileged neighborhoods create sustainable food sources. Not once did they mention deals or exhibitions or retreats as achievements in themselves. Instead, they spoke of the meaning behind their work, the connections it created, the purpose it served. It was a subtle shift, but a profound one, a reorientation toward what truly mattered. After dinner, we gathered in the living room for our gift exchange. My own offerings were modest but personal, books chosen specifically for each child, reflecting conversations we'd had over the past weeks. For James, a collection of poems his father had loved. For Olivia, a volume on the intersection of art and healing. For Michael, a biography of a physician who had balanced Western medicine with ancient wisdom traditions. "There's one more gift," Matthew announced when the floor was clear of wrapping paper. "From Richard." My children looked up in surprise. "Dad?" James asked. "But he's been gone for 3 years." Matthew nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing an envelope. "Your father asked me to give you this when the time was right. Eleanor and I agreed that tonight is that time." He handed the envelope to James, who opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a letter, written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. James began to read aloud, his voice steady at first, then increasingly emotional as he progressed through. His father's words. "My dear children, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and your mother has deemed it the right moment to share these thoughts with you. There is much I wish I could tell you in person, but perhaps these words will carry something of my heart to yours. First, you should know how immensely proud I am of each of you. Not for your accomplishments, impressive though they are, but for the qualities of character I've glimpsed beneath the surface of your success, James's profound sense of responsibility, Olivia's courageous creativity, Michael's compassionate insight. These are the true measures of a life well lived, not titles or accolades or financial statements. I fear, however, that the world has convinced you otherwise. I've watched with increasing concern as the demands of success have pulled you away from what matters most: connection, presence, joy. I've seen how achievement, pursued as an end in itself, has become a kind of prison, isolating you from yourselves and from each other. Your mother and I made a decision many years ago to shield you from knowledge of our financial resources. We believed we were protecting you, giving you the gift of self-reliance. Perhaps we were right. Perhaps we were wrong. What matters now is not the past, but the future you will create. Whatever your mother has planned regarding our estate, know that it comes from a place of profound love and concern for your well-being. Eleanor has always seen clearly, not just what is, but what could be. Trust her vision, even when, especially when, it challenges your assumptions or disrupts your carefully constructed plans. Remember that true wealth has little to do with money. It resides in moments of connection, in work that serves something larger than oneself, in the courage to be vulnerable and authentic in a world that rewards armor and performance. These are the inheritances that matter, the legacies that endure. I leave you with a question, the same one I asked myself at crucial moments in my own journey. What kind of ancestor do you wish to be? How will you be remembered by those who come after you? Not just your accomplishments, but the quality of your presence, the impact of your choices, the example of your life. With endless love, your father. Silence filled the room when James finished reading. Olivia wiped tears from her cheeks. Michael stared at the Christmas tree, his expression contemplative. James carefully refolded the letter, his hands slightly unsteady. "Did you know what it said?" James asked me after a long moment. I nodded. "Your father wrote it during his final months. We discussed it at length." "It's like he could see exactly who we've become," Olivia said, her voice thick with emotion. "All the parts we don't want to acknowledge." "Your father was an extraordinarily perceptive man," Matthew observed. He could see beneath surfaces to what people carried inside, their gifts, their wounds, their deepest yearnings. "Why now?" Michael asked me. "Why give us this letter tonight?" I considered my answer carefully. "Because you're ready to hear it now. 3 weeks ago, you would have dismissed it as sentimental nostalgia. Tonight, I believe you can recognize the truth it contains. The conversation continued late into the evening, weaving between memories of Richard, reflections on his letter, and increasingly honest assessments of their own lives. I contributed when appropriate but mostly listened, witnessing a level of authenticity I hadn't seen from my children in years. By the time Matthew left and my children helped me to bed, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. The day had demanded more energy than I had to give, but the cost seemed worth it. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A door had opened, even if just a crack. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of pain management, brief moments of clarity, and increasingly frequent visits from the hospice team. My decline accelerated, my body surrendering territory more rapidly than even Dr. Winters had predicted. My children maintained their rotation, but now they spent more time together in the house, their previous competitiveness giving way to mutual support in the face of my failing health. Anne. New Year's Eve, I asked to be moved to the sunroom, where I could see the garden Richard had tended so lovingly for decades. Snow blanketed the dormant plants, but I could still visualize the riot of colors that would emerge in spring, colors I would not live to see. James arranged pillows behind me while Olivia adjusted my blankets. Michael sat nearby, reading aloud, from one of Richard's favorite books. The simple domesticity of the scene brought an unexpected wave of peace. Whatever happened after I was gone, this moment was real. My children, together, caring for me and for each other with genuine attention and concern. As evening approached, Matthew arrived with Diane, my attorney. My children looked surprised. At Diane's presence, questioning glances passing between them. I asked them both to come, I explained, my voice weaker than it had been even that morning. There are matters we need to discuss while I'm still able. Mom, you don't need to worry about any of that now, James began, his protective instincts engaging. I'm not worried, I assured him. But I am practical. Some conversations shouldn't wait. Diane set her briefcase on the coffee table, removing several folders with her usual efficiency. Eleanor has asked me to review certain aspects of her estate plan with all of you present. My children straightened, attention sharpening. The conditions remain as previously explained, Diane continued. Each of you will have the opportunity to receive 1/3 of Eleanor's estate upon completion of specific tasks that she has designed for you. Matthew, as trustee, will oversee this process. We understand that, Olivia said, a note of impatience in her voice. We've had weeks to process it. What you may not understand, Diane replied evenly, is that Eleanor has made a recent amendment to her will, a codicil that addresses an additional possibility. This was new information even to Matthew, who looked at me with raised eyebrows. What additional possibility? James asked, leaning forward. The possibility of collective success, I answered, gathering my strength to explain this final element of my plan. The original conditions offer each of you an individual inheritance. Based on individual completion of your assigned tasks, the amendment creates a fourth option. Diane handed each of my children a document outlining the details. If all 3 of you successfully complete not only your individual tasks, but also demonstrate genuine collaboration and mutual support throughout the process, the estate will be divided differently. How differently? Michael asked, skimming the document. Instead of 1/3 each, you would receive 1/4 each, I explained. The remaining quarter, approximately $3 million, would be placed in a family foundation dedicated to educational initiatives that you would manage together. A foundation? James looked up from the document. That we'd run collectively? Yes, I confirmed. With Matthew's guidance initially, but eventually independently as a family board. What would that require from us? Olivia asked, her artistic mind already visualizing possibilities. Beyond completing our individual tasks, I mean. Regular, Meetings, joint decision-making, genuine consideration of each other's perspectives, I outlined. The foundation would require you to function as a family unit, not just as individuals who happen to share DNA. My children were quiet, absorbing this new dimension of my plan. I watched their faces, trying to gauge their reactions. "This isn't about the money anymore, is it?" Michael said finally. "It never really was." I smiled faintly. "The money is real, and it will be yours if you meet the conditions. But no, this isn't primarily about financial inheritance. It's about a different kind of legacy altogether." "You're trying to rebuild our family," James stated, the realization dawning in his eyes. "To recreate connections that have eroded over time." "Not rebuild," I corrected gently. "That suggests returning to something that existed before. I'm suggesting something new. A family relationship based on who you are now, not who you were as children. A connection built on adult choice rather than childhood obligation." "And you think managing a foundation together would create that?" Olivia sounded skeptical. "I think shared purpose has a way of revealing character and creating bonds that might not form otherwise," I replied. "The foundation is simply a vehicle, a structure around which new patterns of interaction might develop." Matthew, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "Your mother has given this a great deal of thought. The foundation's focus, educational opportunity, reflects values that both Eleanor and Richard held deeply. It would be a living legacy of their life's work." A silence fell over the room as my children contemplated this additional layer to my estate plan. The quiet stretched until James broke it with an unexpected question. "Mom, what do you want? Not what you've planned or structured or legally arranged. What do you want for us in the simplest terms?" The question caught me off guard. Throughout my illness, throughout the complex estate planning and condition setting, no one had asked that fundamental question. What did I want? "I want you to find your way back to each other," I said simply. "I want you to remember that success without connection is hollow. I want you to experience the joy that comes from being truly known and accepted by people who share your history and blood." My voice faltered slightly. "I want you to have what your father and I had. Not just love, but witnessing. The profound gift of being seen, across decades, by someone who remembers who you were and believes in who you might become." Tears filled Olivia's eyes. Michael reached for my hand. James looked away, but not before I glimpsed the emotion he was fighting to control. "That's what these tasks are designed to facilitate," I continued. "Not punishment, not manipulation, but opportunity. The chance to rediscover parts of yourselves you've set aside in the pursuit of external achievement. The possibility of connection that endures beyond my lifetime." The conversation continued as evening deepened into night, but I found myself drifting, consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide. Fragments of discussion reached me through increasing fog, questions about the foundation's structure, clarifications, about the timeline for tasks, practical matters of execution. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I opened my eyes again, the room was dim, lit only by the multicolored glow of the Christmas tree lights. My children remained, James in the armchair by the window, Olivia and Michael on opposite ends of the sofa. They were talking quietly, their voices a gentle murmur beneath the soft classical music playing from the stereo. I watched them without alerting them to my wakefulness, James gesturing as he made a point, Olivia nodding thoughtfully, Michael listening with genuine attention. They were discussing the foundation, I realized, already exploring possibilities for its focus and impact. The scene brought a profound sense of peace, a feeling that perhaps I had accomplished what I'd set out to do. Not completely. The real work would begin after I was gone, when they faced their individual tasks and the challenge of collaboration. But the foundation had been laid, the possibility established. As I drifted back toward sleep, I felt Richard's presence almost tangibly, as though he were sitting beside me, his hand covering mine as it had so many times during our life together. They'll find their way, I thought to him. Not without struggle, not without resistance, but they'll find their way back to what matters. The certainty of this knowledge carried me into dreams, visions of a future I wouldn't witness but had helped to shape. My children, gathered around a table, disagreeing, passionately but respectfully about foundation grants. My grandchildren, growing up with a model of family that transcended geographic distance and professional demands. A legacy of connection that extended far beyond bank accounts or property deeds. It was enough. Whatever happened next, it was enough. January arrived with bitter cold and the inevitable progression of my disease. Each day brought new limitations, new surrenders. My world contracted to the dimensions of my bed, then to the awareness of my breath, shallow and labored. The hospice team increased my medications, prioritizing comfort over consciousness. A trade-off I accepted with surprising equanimity. During moments of clarity, I observed the subtle transformation occurring around me. My children had abandoned their rotation system, all three remaining in the house constantly now. They worked remotely when necessary, but increasingly, they set aside professional obligations to be present. Not just physically present, but attentive in ways I hadn't experienced from them in years. James read to me from my favorite poetry collections, his voice steady even when emotion made it difficult. Olivia brushed and braided my thinning hair each morning, her artist's hands gentle against my scalp. Michael applied the lavender-scented lotion I'd always loved, massaging my swollen feet with the reverence he typically reserved for his spiritual practices. These simple acts of care revealed aspects of my children I feared had been lost to ambition. And acceleration, tenderness, patience, the willingness to be present with discomfort rather than avoiding it. I didn't delude myself that they had undergone complete transformations, but I recognized the significance of these small shifts, these moments of genuine connection. On a particularly lucid afternoon in mid-January, I asked Matthew to bring a specific item from my desk drawer, a small leather journal I'd maintained throughout my illness. James was helping me sip water when Matthew returned with the book. "What's this?" James asked as Matthew placed it on my lap. "Something I want to share with all of you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper now. "Could you ask Olivia and Michael to join us?" When all three of my children were gathered around my bed, I handed the journal to Michael. "Would you read from it? Start with the entry from September 18th. He opened the journal carefully, flipping to the date I'd indicated, and began to read. September 18th. Dr. Winters confirmed today what I've suspected for weeks. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 to 8 months, he said, though the look in his eyes suggested less. Strange how such devastating news can bring clarity rather than chaos. I find myself thinking not about death, but about legacy. Not the money or property, but what truly matters. What will I leave in my children's hearts when I'm gone? What lessons remain unlearned? What connections unmade? Perhaps this ending is also a beginning, a final opportunity to teach what matters most. Michael's voice faltered slightly, but he continued to the next entry I indicated. October 3rd, met with Diane today to discuss the estate plan. She thinks my approach is unusual, possibly even unfair. Perhaps it is, but conventional inheritance would only reinforce patterns that have diminished my children's lives. Money, without meaning, abundance without appreciation. The tasks I'm designing aren't punishments. They're invitations to remember, to reconnect, to rediscover parts of themselves they've sacrificed at the altar of achievement. Will they understand? Probably not initially, but understanding isn't required for transformation to begin. I asked him to skip ahead several pages to a more recent entry. December 26th. Christmas brought unexpected gifts. not the wrapped packages, but moments of authentic presence. I glimpsed the children they once were beneath the polished exteriors they've constructed. James laughing without restraint at a family story. Olivia's defenses lowering as she described her new artistic direction. Michael listening, truly listening, to his siblings without preparing his response. These are small victories, but significant ones. Seeds planted that may continue to grow after I'm gone. When Michael finished reading, silence filled the room. My children exchanged glances, absorbing the window into my thoughts during these final months. "There's one more entry," I said softly. "From this morning. I asked the nurse to help me write it." Michael turned to the most recent page and read the shaky handwriting that was barely recognizable as my own. January 18th. As my body fails, my vision clarifies. I see now that these months of illness have themselves been a gift, not one I would have chosen, but valuable nonetheless. They have stripped away pretense and performance, creating space for what matters most. I've witnessed small miracles in my children's presence, not dramatic transformations, but significant redirections. Whether they ultimately complete the tasks I've designed matters less than I once thought. Seeds have been planted. Growth has begun. The rest is in their hands, and in God's. Olivia wiped tears from her cheeks, not bothering to hide her emotion as she might have weeks earlier. "Why are you showing us this now?" "Because you deserve to understand," I replied, each word requiring effort now, to know that this journey, my illness, the estate plan, all of it, has never been about control or manipulation. It's been about possibility, about love expressed through challenge rather than indulgence. "The tasks," James said quietly. "Will they be difficult?" I managed a small smile. "Difficult in the way that growth is always difficult. They will require courage, honesty, vulnerability. But they aren't designed to be impossible or punitive." "Will we know when we've completed them?" Michael asked. "Will there be clear markers of success?" "You'll know," I assured him. "And Matthew will confirm. The tasks are specific, though their impact may be broader than their requirements." "And if we fail?" Olivia's question hung in the air. "Then the money goes to charity, as we've discussed," I replied. "But even then, the attempt itself may yield value beyond financial inheritance. Some lessons are learned in the striving, not just in the achievement." James leaned forward, taking my hand in his. "I want you to know something, Mom. Whatever happens with these tasks, whatever challenges you've designed for us, I'm grateful. Not for the potential inheritance, but for this time. For the chance to be here, with you. For the opportunity to remember what matters." His words, so different from what he might have said just months ago, brought tears to my eyes. Olivia moved closer, her hand joining James's on mine. "I'm grateful too," she said softly. "I've been so caught up in my work, in proving myself, in chasing the next achievement. I almost missed this chance to simply be your daughter again." Michael completed the circle, his hand covering his siblings. "We've all been lost in our own ways, haven't we? Succeeding by the world's standards but failing at what truly matters." I looked at my 3 children, gathered around me with a unity I hadn't witnessed in years, and felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Whatever happened after I was gone, whether they completed their tasks, whether they collaborated on the foundation, whether they maintained the connections beginning to reform between them, this moment was real. This circle of hands, this acknowledgement of what mattered, this presence with each other. The days that followed passed in a haze of medication and fleeting consciousness. I was aware of my children's voices, sometimes reading to me, sometimes sharing memories, sometimes simply assuring me of their presence. I heard Matthew's steady tones, felt the gentle hands of the hospice nurses, sensed the gradual withdrawal of my spirit from my failing body. On January 29th, just as dawn broke over the horizon, I opened my eyes to find all three of my children asleep in chairs beside my bed. They had maintained a constant vigil for days now, unwilling to leave even for brief periods. The sight filled me with a final rush of love so intense it felt almost physical, a tangible warmth spreading from my center outward. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Olivia. Michael." They stirred immediately, moving closer to the bed. "I'm here, Mom," James said, taking my hand. "We're all here," Olivia added, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. Michael simply held my other hand, his presence a steady anchor as my awareness began to drift. "Remember," I managed, each word requiring immense effort now. "The tasks, not about the money, about what matters." "We understand," James assured me, though I wondered if they truly did. If anyone could fully understand a lesson they hadn't yet experienced. "Love each other," I whispered. "Witness each other. That's the real inheritance." I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness growing diffuse, expanding beyond the boundaries of my failing body. My last awareness was of my children's hands, holding mine, their tears falling, their promises whispered like prayers in the quiet morning light. And then, release. I couldn't have anticipated what followed my death, the individual journeys my children would undertake, the challenges they would face, the transformations that would occur. And yet, in some inexplicable way, I remained a witness to their unfolding. Stories, an observer from beyond the veil that separates life from whatever comes after. The funeral was held on a snow-covered February morning, the cemetery blanketed in white that glittered under pale sunlight. My children arranged everything with thoughtful attention to what I would have wanted, simple, meaningful, focused on life's continuity rather than its ending. James delivered a eulogy that balanced emotion with eloquence, speaking of lessons learned and connections renewed. Olivia created a memorial program featuring her artwork alongside carefully chosen photographs from family albums. Michael arranged for my favorite classical pieces to be performed by a string quartet, the melodies floating through the chapel like whispered conversations. What surprised me most, however, was not the ceremony itself, but the unity displayed by my children throughout. They moved as a cohesive unit, supporting each other, making decisions collaboratively, presenting a united front to the stream of mourners who came to pay their respects. This wasn't the competitive, disconnected trio of months earlier. Something had shifted, foundations laid during my final weeks that continued to build even in my absence. A week after the funeral, Matthew invited them to his home for the formal reading of my will and the revelation of their individual tasks. They arrived together, having met for dinner beforehand, another small but significant change in their patterns of interaction. Matthew's living room, with its wall of books and comfortable leather furniture, provided the perfect setting for this crucial conversation. He offered them coffee before retrieving a wooden box from his study, a box I had crafted with him months earlier, during the early days of my diagnosis. "Your mother prepared this with great care," Matthew explained, placing the box on the coffee table. "Inside are 3 sealed envelopes, each containing the specific task designed for one of you." My children studied the box, its surface carved. With a simple but meaningful design, a tree with 3 distinct branches emerging from a single trunk. "Before we proceed," Matthew continued, "I want to clarify my role in this process. I am the trustee of your mother's estate, responsible for verifying the completion of each task before funds can be distributed. However, I am not here to judge, to interfere, or to direct your journeys. Those are yours alone to navigate." "How will this work exactly?" James asked, his practical nature asserting itself. "Do we open these envelopes now? Is there a timeline?" "You'll each open your envelope privately, When you're ready to begin your task, Matthew explained. The timeline is as your mother specified, 1 year from her passing. You have until January 29th of next year to complete the requirements. And we can't discuss our tasks with each other? Olivia confirmed. That's correct, Matthew nodded. Your mother believed each journey should remain individual, at least initially. You may choose to share details as you progress, but that decision should be yours, not prescribed. What about the foundation option? Michael asked. The possibility of collaboration. That remains available, Matthew assured them. If all three of you complete your individual tasks and demonstrate genuine collaboration, the modified distribution will apply with the foundation established as outlined. He opened the box, revealing 3 cream-colored envelopes, each sealed with wax and marked with a name in my handwriting. He handed them to their recipients, who accepted them with varying expressions of trepidation and curiosity. I recommend you take some time before opening these, Matthew advised. Find a quiet space, a moment when you can fully absorb what's being asked of you. These tasks weren't designed lightly or arbitrarily. Each represents your mother's deep understanding of your individual journeys. My children nodded, tucking the envelopes away rather than opening them immediately, a small act of restraint that pleased me. They asked a few practical questions about the estate's current status, about contact procedures with Matthew, about logistics that would need to be managed in my absence. As they prepared to leave, James paused, turning back to Matthew with an unexpected question. Did you know my mother well, Uncle Matt? I mean beyond the friendship you shared with both our parents? Matthew considered this thoughtfully. I knew Eleanor in ways that perhaps few others did, he replied. We taught at the same school for many years, shared countless conversations about education, philosophy, the meaning of a well-lived life. She was extraordinary, not just intelligent but wise. She saw possibilities in people that they often couldn't see in themselves. Including us? Olivia asked softly. Especially you, Matthew confirmed. She never stopped believing in who you could become, even when your paths diverged from what she might have hoped. That's what these tasks represent. Not disappointment, but profound hope and belief in your capacity for growth. This perspective seemed to comfort them, softening the edges of uncertainty as they left Matthew's home, envelopes in hand, futures temporarily contained in sealed messages waiting to be revealed. In the weeks that followed, I witnessed each of them approach their envelope in characteristic fashion. James, ever the strategist, opened his immediately upon returning to his hotel room, analyzing the requirements with the same focused attention he gave to business proposals. I watched his expression shift from calculation to disbelief, to reluctant understanding, as he absorbed what was being asked of him. Olivia waited 3 days, taking her envelope to her Chicago apartment, where she placed it on her mantel, circling it like a challenging art installation requiring proper consideration before engagement. When she finally opened it, she read the contents multiple times, alternating between resistance and intrigue before setting it aside to percolate, as she often described her creative process. Michael, true to his reflective nature, carried his envelope to a lakeside retreat center, meditating for a full day before carefully breaking the seal during sunrise on the 3rd morning. His reaction was the most accepting. A soft smile, a thoughtful nod, an immediate recognition of the task's purpose despite its difficulty. I couldn't know their exact thoughts as they absorbed their assignments, but I sensed the mixture of resistance and recognition that each experienced. The tasks I had designed weren't randomly chosen challenges, but carefully crafted invitations to address specific patterns that had diminished their lives, patterns they recognized but had carefully avoided confronting. For James, the task involved stepping away from his relentless professional pace to rebuild connections with his children, not through extravagant experiences or outsourced quality time, but through consistent, humble presence during ordinary moments. He would need to reduce his work hours significantly, engage in daily activities with Emma and Jacob, and learn to prioritize relationship over achievement in tangible, measurable ways. Olivia's challenge centered on vulnerability, establishing genuine connections beyond the curated relationships that populated her artistic circle. She would need to volunteer weekly at a community arts program for disadvantaged youth, allowing herself to be known not as an acclaimed artist, but as a fellow creator, open to both giving and receiving wisdom across differences of background and status. Michael faced perhaps the most personally confronting task, reconciling his spiritual seeking with practical service by returning to medicine in a limited capacity, volunteering at a free clinic while maintaining his wellness practice. His journey would require integrating his seemingly divergent paths rather than treating them as separate or contradictory aspects of his identity. Each task reflected my intimate knowledge of my children, their gifts, their wounds, their areas of growth most desperately needed, yet most persistently avoided. Each represented a reconnection with values they had once held, but gradually set aside in pursuit of external markers of success. And each, though distinct in its requirements, shared a common thread: the necessity of genuine presence, vulnerability, and service to something beyond themselves. In the days following their receipt of these assignments, I observed my children's initial responses from whatever intangible vantage point I now occupied. James immediately began researching how to restructure his work commitments, his mind engaging with the challenge as he would a complex negotiation. Olivia researched community, arts programs with the same intensity she typically reserved for gallery research. Michael sat in extended meditation, seemingly seeking guidance from his spiritual practices before taking concrete action. None of them contacted Matthew immediately to discuss alternatives or exceptions. None of them rejected the tasks outright or dismissed them as irrelevant. This alone represented progress, a willingness to consider that perhaps, despite their accomplished status, they still had important things to learn, important ways to grow. As February gave way to March, my children began tentative steps toward their respective journeys. James had a difficult conversation with his firm about reducing his client load and restructuring his schedule to accommodate regular school pickups and family dinners, changes met with significant resistance from partners who had come to rely on his relentless availability. Olivia made initial contacts with several community arts organizations, though she approached these conversations with a carefully maintained professional distance. Michael reached out to former medical colleagues, exploring possibilities for limited clinical work that would honor both his training and his evolved perspective on healing. Small beginnings, hesitant steps, but movement nonetheless in directions that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I couldn't know whether they would ultimately complete their tasks, whether they would embrace the deeper transformations these challenges invited, whether they would eventually collaborate on the foundation I had envisioned. Those outcomes remained uncertain, dependent on choices they had yet to make, growth they had yet to experience. But I had done what I could, created the conditions for possibility, designed invitations to reconnection, planted seeds that might continue to grow beyond my lifetime. The rest would unfold according to its own timeline, shaped by my children's decisions and whatever grace might operate beyond my understanding or control. For now, it was enough to have witnessed their beginnings, these first steps toward what might become profound journeys of rediscovery and reconnection. Enough to have created the possibility that my final lesson might ultimately be received, not as an obligation tied to inheritance, but as a gift offered from love that transcended even death's boundary. Spring arrived with tentative warmth and new beginnings. 3 months had passed since my death, and my children's journeys were unfolding in ways both expected and surprising. James faced the most immediate professional consequences from his task. His decision to restructure his work commitments, limiting travel, declining new clients, leaving the office by 5 each day, was met with barely concealed hostility from his partners. "You're at a critical point in your career trajectory," Gerald, the managing partner, told him during a tense meeting in early April. "This isn't the time to step back. The Beijing clients specifically asked for you on the Singapore expansion." "I understand," James replied, his resolve visibly wavering under the pressure. "But I've made commitments to my family that I need to honor. Perhaps Wei Lin could take point on Singapore." "She's more than capable." Gerald's expression hardened. "This firm operates at the highest levels because our top people prioritize excellence. If your priorities have shifted, perhaps we need to reconsider your partnership track." It was a thinly veiled threat, one that would have immediately redirected James's decisions just months earlier. I watched with pride as my son took a measured breath before responding. "My priorities haven't shifted away from excellence," he said carefully. "They've expanded to include excellence in domains beyond work. I remain committed to this firm, but not at the expense of my children's well-being." The conversation ended, without resolution, leaving James in the professional limbo of having challenged a fundamental cultural expectation of his workplace. In the weeks that followed, he felt the subtle isolation techniques employed against those who violate unspoken rules, being excluded from certain meetings, receiving terse responses to emails, finding himself removed from client communications. The old James would have immediately capitulated, working longer hours to prove his commitment and regain favor. This James, however, used his newly available evenings to establish rituals with his children, helping 12-year-old Emma with her science projects, teaching 9-year-old Jacob to play chess, reading bedtime stories that often extended into deeper conversations about their lives and interests. One Tuesday evening in late April, James arrived home to find Christine, his wife, observing him with puzzled curiosity as he helped the children with dinner preparations, a task he'd previously considered outside his domain of responsibility. "What's happening with you?" she asked when the children had gone upstairs to finish homework. "This is the third week you've been home for dinner every night. You haven't checked your phone once during family time. You remembered that Emma had a recital tomorrow." She studied him with a mixture of appreciation and suspicion. "It's not that I'm complaining, but this isn't like you." James considered his response carefully. "I've been thinking a lot since Mom died, about what matters, about what I want my children to remember about their childhood." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I don't want to be the father who missed everything important because he was always closing another deal." "I've been telling you that for years," Christine pointed out, though without the bitterness that had characterized similar conversations in the past. "What changed?" James thought about my task, about the specific requirements I'd outlined for rebuilding connections with his children. But the more he reflected, the more he realized the task itself wasn't what had ultimately motivated his change. "Watched my mother die," he said simply. "I saw her looking back on her life, evaluating what mattered most to her. It wasn't career achievements or financial success. It was relationships, connections, the moments of genuine presence with the people she loved." He met Christine's gaze directly. "I don't want to wait until I'm dying to recognize what truly matters." Christine studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope this isn't temporary," she said. "The kids they're flourishing with your attention. They light up when you walk through the door now instead of barely looking up from their devices." "It's not temporary," James assured her. "I might not have gotten everything right yet, but I'm committed to this change." That conversation marked a subtle but important shift in their marriage, the beginning of a true partnership rather than the parallel lives they had been living. Christine's initial wariness gradually gave way to cautious appreciation as James continued to demonstrate consistent presence with their family. Professionally, James faced increasing pressure as his partner's displeasure evolved from subtle exclusion to explicit criticism. By early May, he was called into another meeting with the executive committee. "Your billables are down 20%, Gerald stated without preamble. 3 clients have specifically asked why you're not leading. their projects anymore. This situation is untenable, James. My work quality remains excellent, James countered. My existing clients are satisfied. I've simply adjusted my volume to accommodate family responsibilities. That's not how partnership works here. Gerald's tone was final. You need to decide where your priorities lie. It was the ultimatum James had been expecting, the moment of truth that would determine whether his recent changes represented a genuine transformation or a temporary adjustment. In the past, his response would have been automatic: recommit to work, promise improved performance, make whatever sacrifices necessary to maintain his professional trajectory. But something had shifted within him, a reorientation so fundamental that his response surprised even himself. I understand, he said calmly. I'll have my decision for you by the end of the week. Rather than immediately backtracking, James spent the next 3 days in deep reflection, consulting not just with Christine but, surprisingly, with his siblings. He called Olivia and Michael separately, then arranged a video call with all 3 of them, the first such conversation they had initiated without external prompting since my death. I'm facing a choice, he explained, outlining the situation at his firm. Essentially, I need to decide whether maintaining my current career trajectory is worth the cost to my family relationships. What does Christine think? Olivia asked, displaying an interest in her sister-in-law's perspective that would have been uncharacteristic just months earlier. She's supportive either way, James replied. She appreciates the changes I've made, but understands the financial implications if I leave the partnership track. Is that what you're considering? Michael looked surprised. Leaving your firm entirely? Possibly. Or restructuring my role. Or finding a firm with more family-friendly policies. James ran a hand through his hair, that gesture so reminiscent of his father. I've been approached by some smaller firms over the years. Less prestige, less money, but more flexibility. What's stopping you? Olivia asked directly. James considered the question with unusual honesty. Ego, partly. I've defined myself by professional success for so long. And practicality, too. My current compensation supports a certain lifestyle. A lifestyle that makes you happy? Michael's question was gentle but probing. I thought it did, James admitted. Now I'm not so sure. Their conversation continued for over an hour, exploring options and implications with a depth and mutuality that would have been impossible in their previous patterns of interaction. No one offered easy answers or dismissive solutions. Instead, they listened, questioned, supported, functioning as a family rather than as competitive individuals with tenuous biological connections. By the end of the week, James had made his decision. He requested another meeting with the executive committee and arrived with a detailed proposal, a restructured role that would allow him to maintain selected client relationships while reducing his overall workload and eliminating most travel requirements. His compensation would decrease proportionally, but he would retain certain partnership benefits. This isn't how we operate, Gerald stated flatly after reviewing the proposal. Then perhaps it's time to reconsider how you operate, James replied, with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from clarity. The world is changing. The next generation of talent won't accept the sacrifices our generation normalized. Firms that adapt will attract and retain the best people. The committee ultimately rejected his proposal, but offered a compromise, a 1-year sabbatical after which he could return to his current role if he chose. It wasn't ideal, but it provided space for James to explore alternatives without burning bridges entirely. That evening, he called Matthew to update him on his progress with my task. I'm not sure if I'm meeting the exact requirements Mom outlined, he admitted. But something is shifting in me, in how I see my work, my family, what matters most. Your mother wasn't concerned with technicalities, Matthew assured him. She wanted genuine transformation, not just compliance with specific actions. From what you've described, you're on exactly the path she hoped you'd find. While James navigated his professional recalibration, Olivia faced different challenges with her assigned task. Finding a community arts program wasn't difficult. Chicago offered numerous options for volunteers wanting to work with disadvantaged youth. The true challenge came in allowing herself to be vulnerable within those environments, to be known as a person rather than a professional identity. She chose a storefront art center in one of the city's struggling neighborhoods, a grassroots organization offering free classes to children and teens. Her initial approach was characteristic, arriving with a detailed curriculum plan, dressed in carefully curated, accessible artist attire, maintaining the slight distance of a visiting professional. Marisa, the center's director, saw through the performance immediately. "We appreciate your interest," she said during Olivia's orientation, "but our kids don't need another adult showing up to improve them. They need authentic connection with people who see their value." "That's exactly what I want to offer," Olivia insisted, somewhat defensively. Marissa's expression remained kind but challenging. "Is it? Because authenticity requires vulnerability, and I'm not seeing much of that from you yet." The observation stung precisely because it echoed my own words in the letter accompanying Olivia's task. I had written, "Your art reveals profound emotional depth, yet your relationships remain carefully curated performances. This task isn't about teaching skills, but about allowing yourself to be truly seen, flawed, uncertain, and genuinely present." Olivia might have walked away from the challenge, found another program with less perceptive leadership. Instead, she returned the following week, slightly less polished in her presentation, slightly more open to genuine engagement. The teens in her first workshop immediately tested her boundaries, questioning her credentials, challenging her assumptions about their interests and needs. "Why should we listen to you?" demanded Terrell, a talented 16-year-old whose graffiti art displayed remarkable spatial understanding. "You probably never had to worry about anything real." The old Olivia would have responded with professional deflection or curated self-disclosure. Carefully selected personal details that suggested authenticity without revealing genuine vulnerability. This Olivia, however, paused thoughtfully before responding. "You're partly right," she admitted. "I've had privileges many people don't: financial security, excellent education, professional opportunities. But that doesn't mean I haven't faced real struggles." She met his gaze directly. "The hardest thing for me has been allowing myself to be genuinely known by others. I'm very good at performing the role of successful artist, but much less practiced at simply being human with other humans." Her unexpected honesty shifted the energy in the room. Not dramatically. These teens had experienced too many temporary adult presences in their lives to trust quickly, but perceptibly. The workshop proceeded with less hostility, more tentative engagement. In the weeks that followed, Olivia gradually abandoned her prepared curriculum, allowing the sessions to evolve organically based on the interests and needs expressed by the participants. She shared more authentic aspects of her artistic journey, not just the successes but the failures, the doubts, the projects abandoned because they revealed too much of her inner landscape. One Wednesday afternoon in late April, she arrived at the center to find Tyrell working intensely on a piece that incorporated elements of traditional portraiture with street art techniques. She observed quietly, appreciating his concentration and the emotional power emerging in his work. "My grandmother," he explained without looking up. "She's dying. Cancer." Olivia felt a rush of recognition, not just of the universal experience of losing loved ones, but of the specific grief she was still processing from my death. "I lost my mother recently," she said softly. "Also to cancer." Tyrell glanced up briefly, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "Did you make art about it?" "Not yet," Olivia admitted. "I haven't found the right approach." Maybe there isn't a right approach, Tyrell suggested, returning to his work. Maybe you just have to let the feelings come through, messy as they are. His insight, so aligned with artistic principles Olivia espoused professionally, but struggled to embody personally, caught her off guard. When did you get so wise? Tyrell shrugged, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Maybe I've always been wise. You're just starting to actually listen. That evening, Olivia returned to her studio and began a new series, not the carefully conceptualized, critically accessible work she typically produced, but raw, emotionally direct pieces emerging from her grief, her regrets, her evolving understanding of what my death had illuminated in her life. She worked through the night, losing herself in authentic expression in a way she hadn't experienced since art school, before success and critical expectations had narrowed her creative freedom. By morning, she had created 3 powerful pieces that felt more genuinely hers than anything she had produced in years. Not coincidentally, they also represented a significant artistic evolution, pushing boundaries she had carefully observed throughout her professional career. She called Michael, something she rarely did without specific reason. Something's happening. With me, she said without preamble. With my art, with how I'm approaching relationships. It's uncomfortable, but necessary, I think. Mom's task? Michael guessed. Yes, but it's becoming more than that. Olivia struggled to articulate the subtle but profound shift occurring within her. It started as fulfilling requirements, but now it feels like remembering something I always knew but somehow forgot. I understand completely, Michael replied, and for perhaps the first time in their adult relationship, Olivia believed he truly did. Michael's own journey with his task had taken yet another path. Returning to medicine after 5 years focused exclusively on his wellness retreats required practical hurdles: licensing updates, credential reviews, liability insurance. But the greater challenge was integrating his seemingly contradictory professional identities. The free clinic where he volunteered 2 days each week served primarily undocumented immigrants and unhoused individuals, patients with complex medical needs complicated by socioeconomic factors and limited access to care. His initial approach was to compartmentalize, functioning as Dr. Harrison at the clinic and Michael at his wellness center, maintaining careful separation between these aspects of his work. This division became increasingly difficult to maintain, as he recognized the limitations of each approach in isolation. His medical training offered crucial interventions for acute conditions, but few solutions for the chronic stress, trauma, and environmental factors undermining his patients' health. His wellness practices provided valuable tools for resilience and self-regulation, but couldn't address untreated infections, uncontrolled diabetes, or the concrete realities of poverty and marginalization. The breakthrough came during a consultation with Eleanor, a 40-year-old woman with chronic pain, elevated blood pressure, and symptoms of depression. After completing a standard medical assessment, Michael found himself hesitating before writing the usual prescriptions. "Elena," he said carefully, "I'd like to try something different, if you're willing. In addition to medication for your blood pressure, I'd like to teach you some breathing techniques that might help with both your pain and your mood." Elena looked skeptical but nodded her agreement. Michael guided her through a simple breathwork sequence, then a brief body scan meditation, adapting practices from his wellness center to fit within the constraints of a clinic appointment. "How do you feel?" he asked when they had finished. "A little better," she admitted, surprise evident in her voice. "The pain is still there, but less sharp somehow. These are tools you can use anywhere, anytime," Michael explained, writing instructions in Spanish and English. "They won't replace medication for your blood pressure, but they might help you manage stress, which affects both pain and blood pressure." In the weeks that followed, Michael began integrating elements of his holistic approach into each clinic visit. carefully documenting outcomes and observations. Rather than rejecting his medical training in favor of alternative approaches or dismissing his wellness practices as merely complementary, he began developing a genuinely integrated model of care that acknowledged the validity and limitations of both paradigms. By early May, he had drafted a proposal for the clinic director, a pilot program offering group sessions teaching stress reduction techniques, nutritional guidance adapted for limited budgets, and movement practices accessible to various physical conditions. The director, initially skeptical, agreed to a small trial based on the positive outcomes Michael had documented with individual patients. Simultaneously, Michael began incorporating more concrete health metrics and medical screening into his wellness retreats, acknowledging that spiritual well-being couldn't be fully separated from physical health. He arranged for a nurse practitioner to conduct basic health assessments for retreat participants, added educational sessions on evidence-based preventive care, and modified meditation practices to address specific health conditions. This integration process wasn't without challenges. Some clinic colleagues viewed his holistic approaches with suspicion, while certain wellness center clients resisted what they perceived as an unwelcome intrusion of conventional medicine into their alternative health sanctuary. Michael navigated these tensions with growing confidence, neither defensive about his medical training nor apologetic about his spiritual practices. One evening in late May, after a particularly challenging but rewarding day at the clinic, Michael called both James and Olivia, something that would have been unusual before my death, but had become increasingly common in recent months. "I've been thinking about Mom's foundation idea," he said when they were all connected. "The provision in her will about the three of us collaborating on an educational foundation if we all complete our tasks." "What about it?" James asked, his voice carrying the fatigue of another day, balancing family presence with professional transition. "I think I'm starting to understand what she was envisioning," Michael continued. "This task she gave me, integrating seemingly contradictory aspects of my work and identity, it's changing how I approach everything. And from what you've both shared about your experiences, something similar is happening for each of you." "And?" Olivia prompted when Michael paused. "And I'm wondering if the foundation might be an opportunity to continue that integration process together. Not just administering funds for educational initiatives, but actually creating something that reflects our collective wisdom, our complementary strengths." "Like what, specifically?" James's practical nature emerged, seeking concrete details. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Michael admitted. "But what if we began imagining possibilities? What if we started planning as though we'll all complete our tasks successfully?" There was a brief silence before Olivia responded. "That's assuming a lot." "Is it?" Michael challenged gently. "From what you've shared about your experiences at the Community Arts Center, from what James has described about his family reconnection process, it seems like we're all well on our way." Another silence, longer this time, before James spoke. "I like the idea of planning proactively. Even if we ultimately don't qualify for the foundation option, the conversation itself might be valuable." "I agree," Olivia added, surprising both her brothers with her ready alignment. "We could meet in person to discuss it. It's been almost 2 months since we were all together." They scheduled a weekend in June, agreeing to meet at my house, now jointly owned by all three of them, another detail of my estate planning designed to maintain a physical center for family connection. The conversation ended with genuine warmth, plans for continued communication, an ease of interaction that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. As spring blossomed into early summer, my children continued their individual journeys while simultaneously building stronger connections with each other. None of them had fully completed their assigned tasks yet. The 1-year timeline I'd established still had months remaining, but the transformations underway extended beyond specific requirements into genuine reorientations of priorities, perspectives, and patterns of relationship. Whether they would ultimately meet all the conditions for their inheritance remained to be seen. But increasingly, that question seemed secondary to the growth already occurring. Growth not motivated primarily by financial incentives, but by rediscovered appreciation for what truly constituted wealth in a well-lived life. January arrived, with crystalline skies and snow that crunched underfoot like tiny bells. 1 year had passed since my death, a milestone that brought my children back to my home for a weekend of remembrance and, more significantly, for the formal evaluation of their tasks. The house looked different now. They had maintained it as a shared family space rather than selling it as many might have expected. Small touches reflected their renewed connection: James's children's artwork on the refrigerator, books from Olivia's latest exhibition on the coffee table, potted herbs from Michael's garden thriving on the sunroom windowsill. It remained a high gathering place, a physical anchor for their evolving relationships with each other. Matthew arrived on a Saturday morning, carrying the wooden box that had contained their task envelopes a year earlier. They gathered in the living room, the same space where they had once discussed my estate plan with such resistance and confusion. "It's hard to believe it's been a year," Olivia said, running her hand along the back of the sofa where I had spent so many final days. "In some ways it feels much longer," James added. "So much has changed." Michael nodded in agreement. "For all of us." Matthew studied them with quiet appreciation before speaking. "Eleanor would be proud of each of you, not just for your efforts regarding the tasks she assigned, but for the spirit in which you've approached them." "Are we here for a formal evaluation?" James asked, his practical nature still present, though tempered now by a new patience, a capacity for presence that had transformed his relationships over the past year. "In a manner of speaking," Matthew replied, placing the box on the coffee table. "Though I believe you already know where you stand regarding your individual tasks." They exchanged glances, each aware of the other's journeys through regular conversations and visits that had become increasingly common throughout the year. James had completed his sabbatical and made the difficult decision not to return to his previous firm. Instead, he had joined a smaller practice offering flexible scheduling and reduced hours, allowing him to maintain meaningful involvement in his children's lives. His income had decreased significantly, but the rewards, Emma's newfound confidence in sharing her thoughts with him, Jacob's pride in their shared weekend projects, Christine's renewed partnership in their marriage, provided a richness that no financial statement could measure. Olivia's work with the Community Art Center had evolved from reluctant volunteerism to genuine engagement. Her weekly sessions had expanded to include intergenerational projects connecting seniors with teens, collaborative public murals, and a scholarship program she had personally funded for talented students like Tyrell. More significantly, her own art had undergone a transformation, moving from conceptual distance to emotional directness. Her most recent exhibition, titled Inheritance, inspired by her journey following my death, had received the most significant critical recognition of her career. Michael had successfully integrated his medical and holistic approaches, developing a model that was gaining attention in both conventional and alternative healing communities. The pilot program at the Free Clinic had expanded to 3 locations, while his wellness retreats now incorporated evidence-based health practices alongside spiritual components. He had recently been invited to speak at a major medical conference about bridging traditional and complementary approaches to care, recognition that validated his courage in reconciling seemingly contradictory aspects of his professional identity. "I believe each of you has completed your individual tasks," Matthew confirmed, "not just technically but authentically, embodying the spirit rather than simply checking boxes." Relief flickered across their faces, though it seemed less significant than it might have a year earlier. The tasks had long since transcended mere requirements for inheritance, becoming catalysts for genuine transformation. "And the foundation option?" Michael asked. "Have we demonstrated sufficient collaboration to qualify for that provision of Mom's will?" Matthew smiled, What do you think? The question invited reflection on their journey as siblings over the past year. What had begun as occasional phone calls had evolved into regular video chats, shared holiday celebrations, coordinated care for my house, and increasingly, discussion of a shared vision for the foundation my estate plan had proposed. I think we've exceeded Mom's expectations, James said after a thoughtful pause. Not because we've been perfect, but because we've been authentic, with ourselves and with each other. I agree, Olivia added. We've moved beyond the competitive independence that characterized our relationships before Mom's illness. We've learned to value our differences as complementary strengths rather than threats. Michael nodded. We've discovered that collaboration doesn't require sacrificing individual identity. If anything, it enhances it by providing context and contrast. Matthew reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. Based on my observations over the past year, I concur with your assessment. You have indeed satisfied the conditions for the foundation option of Eleanor's estate plan. He handed them documents outlining the modified distribution, 1/4 of the estate to each sibling individually, with the remaining quarter designated for establishment of the Harrison Family Foundation for Educational Opportunity. But what happened next surprised even Matthew, and perhaps would have surprised me as well had I not witnessed their gradual transformation throughout the year. We've been discussing an alternative, James said, glancing at his siblings for confirmation before continuing. We'd like to modify the distribution further. Matthew raised his eyebrows. In what way? We're proposing that 20% of the estate go to each of us individually, Olivia explained. The remaining 40% would go to the foundation. You want to increase the foundation's portion? Matthew clarified, clearly surprised. We've discovered something important through this process, Michael added. The most valuable inheritance? Mom left us wasn't financial at all. It was the reconnection with each other, the rediscovery of what truly matters. The foundation gives us a vehicle to extend that legacy, James continued. A way to collaborate meaningfully while supporting educational opportunities that reflect values all three of us share with Mom and Dad. Matthew studied them with undisguised appreciation. Eleanor would be overwhelmed by this decision. It represents exactly the transformation she hoped to catalyze. We've already drafted some initial ideas for the foundation's focus, Olivia said, reaching for her tablet to show Matthew their preliminary plans. What they had created went far beyond conventional philanthropy. Drawing on their complementary strengths and newly integrated perspectives, they had designed a holistic educational initiative combining James's organizational expertise, Olivia's creative vision, and Michael's integrated approach to well-being. The foundation would support not just traditional academic opportunities, but projects addressing the whole student, cultivating creativity, emotional intelligence, and community connection alongside intellectual development. It would focus particularly on students from backgrounds where such integrated educational approaches were rarely available. We see it as a living extension of Mom and Dad's teaching legacies, James explained, not just funding existing programs, but creating new models that might influence educational approaches more broadly. As they walked Matthew through their vision, their enthusiasm and genuine alignment were evident. This wasn't obligation or performance. It was authentic collaboration emerging from transformed individuals bringing their unique gifts to a shared purpose. Later that evening, after Matthew had departed with documentation of their decisions, my children remained in the living room, reminiscing about the journey of the past year. I still can't believe Mom planned all this, Olivia said, shaking her head with a mixture of amazement and appreciation. How did she know exactly what each of us needed? She was always observing, always paying attention, Michael replied, even when we thought she couldn't possibly understand our lives. I underestimated her, James admitted. I saw her as this simple, traditional mother figure with limited understanding of our complicated modern lives. but she saw patterns and possibilities I was completely blind to. The money was just a vehicle, Olivia reflected. The real inheritance was the invitation to transformation and to reconnection, Michael added. Not just with each other, but with parts of ourselves we'd set aside in pursuit of narrowly defined success. James nodded, looking around the room that held so many memories of their childhood, and now of my final days. I wonder if she knows what she accomplished, if she can somehow see how her plan worked exactly as she intended. Better than she intended, Olivia corrected with a small smile. I don't think even Mom anticipated we'd increase the foundation portion voluntarily. Michael raised his glass in a toast. To Mom, the most strategic, insightful teacher any of us ever had. To Mom, James and Olivia echoed, lifting their glasses. As they continued their conversation late into the evening, planning next steps for the foundation, sharing updates about their individual lives, supporting each other through ongoing challenges, I felt a profound sense of completion, a recognition that my final lesson had not only been received, but embraced and expanded upon. The fortune I had hidden for decades had served its purpose, not as financial security, but as a catalyst for authentic connection. My children had rediscovered the true wealth that had always been available to them, the capacity for genuine presence with themselves and each other, for meaningful contribution beyond personal achievement, for joy that transcended circumstance. They would face challenges in the years ahead, individually and collectively. The patterns of a lifetime don't transform completely in a single year, but they had established new foundations, created new possibilities, opened doors that would remain accessible even in difficult moments. More importantly, they had discovered that the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars but in connection, to oneself, to others, to purpose larger than individual gain. They had recognized, in their own unique ways, that true wealth resides not in bank accounts, but in the capacity for authentic presence in a world that desperately needs the gifts each person carries. As their conversation continued, punctuated by laughter and occasional debate, they remained distinctly themselves after all. I felt a final release, a permission to truly rest in the knowledge that my work was complete. My children had found their way back to what mattered most. They had reclaimed their inheritance, not just the money, but the values, the connections, the capacity for meaningful contribution that represented my true legacy. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.